Hey, fellow comic fans, Scott Harris King here, and today I've got another What If for you. This is a series of videos where I talk about sliding door moments in comics where something could have gone in a very different direction than it ended up going, and speculate on what might have happened if it had gone the other way around. And today I'm going to be talking about the Wonder Woman reboot in 1987. I'm going to ask the question, what if instead of George Perez being in charge of that, it was Dan Mishkin? So, Wonder Woman, of course, original series ended with Crisis on Infinite Earths, issue 329, 1986. There was a bit of a hiatus before the new series started in 1987. And when the new series started, it was George Perez. First couple issues he had a co-writer. Pretty quickly was writing it himself and drawing it himself, and it was fantastic. Highly acclaimed. People love the George Perez run. I think it's excellent. The first 20 issues or so, at least, sort of becomes less interesting to me as it goes, but that's just me. But really a great, really important, like fundamental Wonder Woman story, because Wonder Woman has really not had that many great runs before that, if any. There's only a couple that I would say were really good. So the George Perez run, universally acclaimed, but George Perez wasn't the only person that was pitching ideas for a new Wonder Woman. One of the other people who pitched for the new Wonder Woman was Dan Mishkin. Now, if you're not familiar with Dan Mishkin, he was the previous writer on Wonder Woman. So Dan Mishkin took over Wonder Woman a little bit after issue 300. Like, I don't know if it was 301 immediately, but Roy Thomas had done the series shortly after 300, 302, 303, somewhere around there. Dan Mishkin comes in and takes over as a Wonder Woman writer. He writes it almost to the end. He doesn't do the final arc. That was by Minnie Newell. But up until then, Dan Mishkin, basically the last 2.5, well, even longer because it wasn't monthly. So last few years of Wonder Woman there, last 25 issues or so, until the very final storyline, Dan Mishkin was writing it. Now, I've mentioned this before. I even showed off my complete run of Bronze Age Wonder Woman before I sold it. There's some videos, you can check that out. But I've read all of the Wonder Woman issues from the beginning of the new look, depowered Wonder Woman era, starting in 1969, until Crisis. And then, of course, I've also read the George Perez issues. So, but for me, in that like 17-year period of what you would call Bronze Age Wonder Woman, Dan Mishkin's run, for me personally, is the best. Well, I really love actually the original depowered Wonder Woman stuff with the jumpsuit, the Emma Peel era Wonder Woman. But Dan Mishkin is a really close second. In terms of classic Wonder Woman, where she got her powers and Secret Identity and Paradise Island and all that stuff that she doesn't have in the New Look era, he's easily the best for me. So, at a convention a few years ago, I met Dan Mishkin and I had him sign some of my Wonder Woman books, which I no longer have. And I talked to him about Wonder Woman, and I told him how much I liked his run. And he told me a really interesting story, and that is that Jeanette Kahn, who was in charge of DC for many years, was taking pitches for what Wonder Woman would be post-Crisis. So a bunch of people were pitching, and I don't know who else was involved in the pitching process. I don't know what their ideas were. But Dan Mishkin said that he pitched an idea for a post-Crisis, completely revamped Wonder Woman series. And I thought the idea was super interesting. So here's what his pitch basically was. He pitched the idea that Diana Prince is basically a thief, like a jewel thief or a cat burglar, sort of a Catwoman-esque figure, a woman who, you know, steals stuff to make a living and is really good at it. And she, in the origin story for the new Wonder Woman, she basically breaks into this museum and she ends up stealing the tiara of Wonder Woman, which is on display. It's this old Amazonian artifact that they have there. And basically, when she puts it on, it gives her the power of Wonder Woman. And so the basic idea behind Dan Mishkin's pitch was basically we would start with a character who is morally gray, who's a thief, who's a criminal, and follow her journey as she sort of becomes a hero. So it's not just she gets the powers, but after she has the powers, with great power comes great responsibility. And sort of as she's thrust into this new role as Wonder Woman, she sort of rediscovers her morality and her humanity, and eventually becomes worthy of being Wonder Woman. I thought it was a really interesting idea, a totally new take on the character. I love the concept. Basically, I mean, it's basically what if Catwoman became Wonder Woman, and I think it's super interesting. I do find comic stories where supervillains have redemption arcs and become heroes to be interesting. I'm a big Avengers fan, and that's like a key thing in Avengers. There's been so many supervillains that have reformed in the pages of Avengers. Same with like Thunderbolts, for instance, the original Thunderbolt series. So I think it could be super interesting, I mean, I would have been totally down with that, particularly because I liked the original Mishkin run so much already. But Dan Mishkin basically told me that Jeanette Kahn absolutely hated it. So there was no chance that was going to happen. And of course, they eventually went with George Perez, which is probably a great idea because of his incredible artwork. And then, he did write some really great stories as well. And the original, even I would say 14 issues of Wonder Woman is sort of one story that's really, really great. So it's certainly not a mistake that happened, but I do wonder what if Jeanette Kahn had liked Dan Mishkin's thing? What if Dan Mishkin then was put in charge and he was writing? I mean, a big question would be, who would the artist have been on that? When Mishkin was doing his original run on Wonder Woman, the artist was Don Heck, who at that period of time was kind of, you would say past his prime, and he got a lot of flack in the media. People were like dumping on him in the comics medium, calling him Don Hack and all this stuff. I actually think his art in that Wonder Woman run is really good. And I think some of his later stuff is, in general, I think his superhero stuff is kind of underrated. But his later work on Wonder Woman in particular, I thought was quite good. But I don't think he would have been a good fit for this. So when you're thinking of like 1987, who's an artist that would make sense on that kind of a story? I don't really know someone. I can't think immediately of someone at DC that would have been right for that. I mean, the person that comes to mind who is working at Marvel at the time, but I think would make for a really interesting artist for that kind of story is Bill Sienkiewicz, because that is just immediately what comes to mind. And I have to say, I'm not a huge fan of his art, his sequential art. I love his covers and stuff, but this was right around the time when he was just finishing his run on New Mutants, which I was buying as it came out, and as a kid who was just getting into comics, I didn't get that at all. Absolutely hated the artwork. But just imagine that story, of basically a supervillain sort of having this redemption arc. Not even a supervillain, but a villain, a thief, an outcast, a misfit, a criminal, growing into the role to become Wonder Woman, this beacon of hope. Again, super interesting story, and I think it needs a really interesting artist. So Bill Sienkiewicz, to me, I don't know, just something about that mix just feels kind of right. But it really interesting just to think of how different it would have been. Would that have been enough star power for the relaunch? Because of course, they initially do the post-crisis Batman. They bring in Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli, and then for the Superman thing, they poach John Byrne from Marvel and bring over John Byrne. I mean, that was probably a big part of the decision. Story aside, they wanted to bring in a big gun like George Perez. Would Perez have been willing to just do the art off of that story for Dan Mishkin? I don't know. Maybe, but I'm not sure his art style actually would work for that kind of story. So, really interesting to think about how different Wonder Woman as a character, Wonder Woman as a series, and post-crisis DC universe would have been if they had that character. Black Canary originally started as a thief as well back in the Golden Age. So it's certainly something that is possible. But super interesting to me, particularly as a fan of Dan Mishkin's Wonder Woman. So that's it for this time. Let me know what you think down below of that concept. Who do you think would have been a good artist for that? What do you think might have happened with Wonder Woman and DC if they had gone that route? Really curious to see your thoughts. I'll see you next time.